All right, everyone. Hello and welcome to the first screencast for Chapter 7. In Chapter 7, we're going to talk about different types of market inefficiencies, different types of ways in which the market outcome doesn't always give us that first best Pareto optimal outcome. And we're going to start in this section with talking about externalities and public goods. So the first thing we need to talk about is something called market failure. Market failure is often used as a reason that governments intervene in market economies. What is market failure? Well, for some types of goods, markets are unlikely to produce the efficient amount of a good. This is called market failure. Remember what we mean by the efficient amount of a good. We mean that technical definition of efficiency called Pareto efficiency, meaning an efficient outcome is one in which I can't make anyone better off without making someone worse off. That's our definition of efficient. And what we saw was that for certain types of goods that met all the conditions of perfect competition and perfect information and all those sorts of things, the market outcome would be efficient, meaning there would be no way to change that final outcome in order to make someone better off without making someone worse off. What we're going to see here is that under certain conditions, and we're going to talk about I think 3 or 4, markets will not give us the efficient allocation or the efficient amount of a good produced. And so what that means is that there is going to be some sort of deadweight loss, and that there is a possible improvement that government could bring about if they intervened into the market. All right. So and this is what I just said. It may be possible for governments to intervene and improve on an inefficient market outcome. Government intervention may also make things worse, though. It's not always a better thing for government to intervene. Many of the same problems that cause markets to produce inefficient outcomes can also cause governments to produce inefficient outcomes. So this is called government failure. When government intervenes and it actually makes the problem worse, this is something known as government failure. All right? This is what we're going to go through in this screencast. So first we need to set forth a taxonomy of different types of goods. So we're going to categorize goods in different ways in this particular chapter. All right. So we're going to have one axis here, the vertical axis. We're going to say that a good can either be rival or non-rival. What does rival mean? Well, rival means that if I consume some of it, then it's gone. Non-rival means that if I consume the good, it's not necessarily gone. Another way that people talk about rival versus non-rival is there an additional marginal cost to producing more of the good? If the good is rival, then there is a marginal cost to producing more of the good. If the good is non-rival, then there's not a marginal cost to producing more of the good. They're kind of the flip side of the same coin. I like the idea of if I eat the hot dog's gone. That's rival. But the book talks about it in terms of, is there an additional marginal cost to producing more of the good? But they're just flip side of the same coin. So a good could be rival or non-rival. The other characteristic is a good could be excludable or non-excludable. What this means is, can you legally prevent someone from consuming the good if the good is provided? Again, the hot dog is a good example. I don't know why I use hot dogs. I don't even like hot dogs, but if I own the hot dog, I can legally prevent you from consuming the hot dog, right? Whereas a fireworks show, once the fireworks show is provided, it's really non-excludable, right? It's on the other side of this dimension. It's hard to prevent people from watching a fireworks show once it's provided, all right? So for most of this class, we've been talking about private goods. What is a private good? It's a good that is rival and it is excludable. That's the definition for us of a private good. It is not necessarily a good that is provided by private firms. Or on the converse, it's not necessarily something that's not provided by government. All right, governments provide private goods. Private firms provide private goods. What makes a good a private good? Is it rival? Is it excludable? Like the hot dog or a hamburger, that's a private good. All right. The flip side is what we're going to talk about a little bit in this chapter, something called public goods. All right. A public good is non-excludable and it's non-rival. The fireworks show I talked about earlier. Once you provide the fireworks show, it's really hard to prevent other people from consuming the fireworks show, and one person's consumption of the fireworks show really doesn't infringe upon another person watching the fireworks show, at least up to some kind of congestion constraint there. All right, so that's a public good. All right. The two other areas of this graph would be club goods are up in the left corner there, and common pool resources down in the bottom right corner. We're not going to really talk about those that much in this class, but if you were to take a public economics class, like the one I'm teaching this summer or this fall, we cover all four of these types of goods in a great amount of detail. All right, but we're going to be talking about mostly in this chapter public goods and other types of private goods that have special characteristics. And what happens is this often causes government to intervene in the markets for these types of goods. All right. So what are a few examples of public goods? Well, national defense, law enforcement, generally available knowledge. So the general knowledge that we have in society is a public good. Once knowledge is created and scientific knowledge is out there, it's hard to prevent people from consuming it. And my consumption of that knowledge doesn't really take away from your consumption of knowledge. It's a non-rival good. So what is the problem with these types of goods, public goods? Well, once the good is produced, it's freely available to everyone. People who don't pay can't be excluded. This means that consumers have an incentive to free ride and not pay, to be a free rider on the good. All right, they would like to not pay for the good and to consume it. This means that too few people will pay for the good, and it's going to be underprovided, or it may not be provided at all. So this is the problem with the voluntary provision of public goods, or the public provision of public goods. Government agencies so what happens is government agencies may either come in and produce the good themselves, police departments, national defense, these are examples of the government providing the good themselves, or governments pay private firms to produce them. Many government-sponsored research efforts, the National Science Foundation, those sorts of organizations try to pay other firms, private firms, researchers, to produce public knowledge and public goods. All right. So what's the problem graphically with this public goods problem? Well, here is a graph, and if the efficient amount of the good, here's supply, here's demand, if the efficient amount of the good was produced, the quantity should be QE and the price should be P1. All right. But what happens in the case of a public good is because people don't want to pay for it, even though they demand it, right? The quantity that is actually produced is actually going to be QM. So all of this area, all of these transactions that don't happen are a deadweight loss. Consumer surplus and producer surplus that is lost because this good is underprovided. If the good isn't provided at all, then you would get a QM here of 0, and the entire triangle here would be the deadweight loss between what is the efficient outcome versus what is the market outcome here. All right. So another example of how we sometimes get market failure is something called externalities. So externalities are imposed when an exchange between two parties harms people or firms outside of that exchange. So we call them third parties. So there's a guy who owns a steel mill and he's making steel, and I'm a car manufacturer and I'm buying steel from him to manufacture the cars. But the steel manufacturer is polluting a river near where the steel mill is. So the third parties, the people who aren't the steel mill company or me, the car manufacturer, we're in the exchange. The third parties, the people not in the exchange, are being harmed by that sort of thing. That's an example of something called a negative externality, when a cost is imposed on third parties. There's also something called a positive externality. So this is when a benefit is provided to third parties. So if someone builds an architecturally interesting building, right? Everyone in the town gets the benefit of that building, or someone provides green space. So here in San Jose, near the Adobe building, they've got a big green space around the building that intersects with a public bike path. So Adobe paid someone to build that park. That was the exchange between those two. But there are other third parties who weren't really part of that exchange who now get to benefit from that positive externality. All right. So what happens in the case of externalities? So in the case of negative externalities, the social cost is not equal to the social benefit. So here, let's look at social cost. So social cost equals private cost plus external cost. So if a good has no negative externalities, then the private cost and the social cost are the same. All right. There's no external cost. So this external cost here is just zero. All right. If there are negative externalities, then the private cost is less than the social cost. All right. Because the private cost plus the external cost would make the social cost bigger than the private cost. Right. So because of this added external cost. So when there are negative externalities, the cost that the parties who are doing the exchange are paying is not the full cost of the transaction. There's this social cost that's happening. So what about social benefits? All right, well, social benefits have a similar formula. Social benefit equals the private benefit plus the external benefits. If a good has no positive externalities, then the private benefit will equal the social benefit. All right. But if a good does have positive externalities, then the private benefit is less than the social benefit, right? So if I get rid of the external benefit here, then social benefit is going to be less than, the private benefit is going to be less than the total social benefit because this is a positive term added to private benefit, all right? So what is this externality problem? Well, the producers and consumers responsible for the external cost or the external benefit don't face the full cost or benefit of their choice, all right? So we expect markets to produce more than the efficient quantity of goods and services when there is an external cost, and we expect markets to produce less than the efficient quantity when there is an external benefit. Let me show you graphically what I mean here. All right, so here is the supply curve for the private cost when only private costs are being taken into account, and here's the standard demand curve. So the market outcome would be QM quantity and P1 price, all right? But it's like the firm is getting a free input. So say this is a memory chip manufacturer and they use clean water in the manufacture of their memory chips and they are polluting the stream, all right? The two parties to the transaction, the computer maker and the computer chip maker, are only paying a tiny, tiny fraction of that social cost, if any at all. But the rest of society is paying that social cost. If they had to pay for that social cost, hypothetically, if they had to pay for that externality, then the supply curve would shift in because now they have to pay for an extra input. Their cost of producing each chip goes up because the inputs are more costly. So this would be the socially, if this would be the supply curve if social costs were taken into account, if the external costs were taken into account, all right? So what happens is we would then have a price of P2. You would have a higher price and a lower quantity at the efficient level of output. So we can measure the deadweight loss of the market outcome by this triangle here. So it's the area, so above the efficient quantity and below the supply curve, the social cost supply curve, and above the private cost supply curve. This is the deadweight loss of the negative externality if we just let the market outcome be the one that we let happen, all right? On the flip side, for a positive externality, here is the demand curve with a private benefit. Here is the supply curve, all right? Well, say with the building of green space or attractive buildings or providing, planting a nice lawn in your neighborhood, that benefit, that external benefit to those third parties, if that was taken into account, the socially efficient demand curve would be this demand curve here. So the efficient quantity wouldn't be QM, which is the market quantity, it would be QE. The price wouldn't be P1, it would be P2. So we'd have a higher price, but a higher quantity produced. So we can measure the deadweight loss of the market outcome by this triangle here. So this is what is lost in terms of surplus if we just allow the market outcome to happen when there is a positive externality.